Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Dennis Reardon, president of Connecticut Audubon. Welcome to this evening's community program. As always, Connecticut wishes to honor the indigenous communities native to the chapter area, including the Pagusset, Wepawag, Quinnipiac, Tucket, Nantucket, and Hammonasset people. As we advocate for the conservation of the land and its wildlife, we're indebted to the work of native and indigenous people who cherished the land for thousands of years before European colonization. And before we get started, let me just tell you about the next few meetings. Next Wednesday, March 16th, we'll have Dr. Brooke Bateman, who's the Director of Climate Science at Audubon, speaking about how natural climate solutions can help mitigate climate change as well as help birds. The following Wednesday, March 23rd, our old friend Pat Lynch will return with some tips on simple, inexpensive changes to make a fairly ordinary suburban yard into a friendlier habitat for all kinds of wildlife. And on Wednesday, March 30th, we'll continue with the climate theme with former Connecticut Deep Commissioner, Dr. Robert Clee, who's now teaching at Yale School of Environment and Yale Law School. And he'll talk to us about his perspective of the local effects of climate change. And he'll present a case for state and local climate policy and the collective next steps. So you can register for these on our website. One last note, please mute yourself during the presentation. And if you have questions, you can enter them in the chat, and at the end, you can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question personally. And now I'm pleased to introduce this evening's presenter, Margery Winters, who is the Assistant Director of Roaring Brook Nature Center in Canton, Connecticut, with Gardening for Wildlife.
All right. Thank you very much, Dennis. Let me just share my screen. We'll get started. So thank you everyone for being here tonight. And let's get this bigger. All right. So we're going to talk about gardening for life. And I would imagine that since you're all here tonight, you're interested in keeping the animals in your yard. I also do another one, gardening with critters. Some people have a sort of antagonistic feeling towards some of the wildlife that we share our land with. I would imagine you're more enthusiastic than that. But we're going to be talking about different things that you can do in your yard. And most of them are very easy to do, and you will attract wildlife. Matter of fact, we have so much wildlife in Connecticut, we're really blessed. But working at the Nature Center, one of the things that I've enjoyed over the years is answering the phone. When people will phone us and say, why don't I have any birds in my yard? And they'll tell us that, they put up a bird feeder and, nothing is coming. Well, nothing would come to that yard. It's a little unprotected. And they will even call and say, I only want to attract the red ones. They're very specific about which birds they like and which ones they don't like. They have fondness for some and not for others. So, it's always a challenge to try to figure out which, what advice to give these people when they want to single out a single species. And of course, for everybody, their home is their castle and they want it to be as lovely as possible. This is, if we had a fleet of people helping us, we might be able to do that, but it's a little daunting. Because gardening is really hard work, especially the way we do it. We clip and prune and mow and everything has a rototill here and a lug. And it's incredibly hard work. And the older I get, the more I appreciate shrubs rather than perennial gardens. But it's hard work. But it doesn't have to be that way. I'd like to say we garden hard. We don't necessarily garden smart. We need to relax a little bit more. We need to let go. Nature really actually likes a messy garden. Your neighbors might not, but there are always parts of your garden that you can leave just a little bit more relaxed than others. This tends to be the typical, suburban yard. I mean, you look at it, there's an awful lot that goes into maintaining, keeping this grass, which is not native, low. You see this Japanese maple. Most of these plants here are not native. There's hardly anything there for the wildlife. The deer might enjoy it, but it's a rather sterile landscape. And yet this is just down the road from my house. My neighbor has a beautiful garden, and she actually has people come in and maintain it. But there's a connection between our gardens and the wild areas. This is the neighbor's yard, and this over here is land that's in preservation in our town. I'm president of the Simsbury Land Trust, and we have land over here. So there's a connection between these two. Wildlife doesn't recognize our property boundaries. They can't go on the map and see where they are. They will wander through our yards just as well as through the wild areas. And I think that's one of the advantages, to have life in our garden. And our gardens can be habitat stepping stones. If we manage our properties properly, it can help connect our wild properties with our residential properties or our developed properties. And I think that's really the goal here, is see how we can cohabitate with the various animals that we share the landscape with. They have every right to be here. And there's some lovely movements out there, to things that can tell us how to do this properly. You can go to the National Wildlife Federation. They have a whole program. You can certify your backyard. And what I really have enjoyed over the last few years is watching the development of the Pollinator Pathway. I know this started in the south west part of Connecticut, and it's really expanded throughout the state. This is an idea that was started, I think, actually out in, it started originally in Norway and then moved out to Seattle, and now it's moving across the country, thinking of how we can connect our landscapes together. And I think our backyards, our front yards, play a really big role in that. So, speaking of pollinators, we all like butterflies in our garden. We have some absolutely beautiful butterflies. In just a few weeks, we'll be seeing, or maybe sooner, we'll see this guy. This is our first butterfly of spring. This is the morning cloak. That picture's not upside down. This is the way they come down the tree. They'll be following the sap suckers, who will be drilling holes in the tree, and the sap will be running out, and that will be their food source until the flowers come out. But we have beautiful butterflies. We also have some pretty stunning moths. So there's a lot of reasons for us, to want to see some of these creatures in our yard. So nature's been working at this for a long, long time. I like to think, WWND, what would nature do? And I think with much of our gardening, we need to think about, would this be something that nature does? Mowing the lawn is not something, exactly the way nature would do it. They do it with herbivores. There's certain things that nature does better than we do. And I think if we adapted our gardening practices to what nature does, we'd be a lot better off. So what do we need to attract wildlife to our yards? Well, it's pretty simple: water, food, and shelter. Those are the three things that we need for bringing the animals to our yards. So let's start with the first one: water. Thirst always comes first. If you have water in your yard, you are guaranteed to have wildlife, because that's the thing, especially in the wintertime. That's the hardest time for the year to get the water. So water, of course, for drinking. Birds absolutely need it to bathe. You all know that, their feathers, they need to bathe in order to keep their feathers in really good shape. If they don't have water to bathe in, they're much more susceptible to the predators. And it doesn't really take much to please a bird. A little uneven spot in the driveway will be adequate. They actually rather like that. It's a nice place. But, if you have an overturned flower pot and a dish on top, or maybe just leave the dish on the ground. There are a lot of birds, as that would prefer it down on the ground. What will really attract them, though, is water. The sound of water will bring them like magnets. And it'll also oxygenate the water and keep it a little bit cleaner. But in the wintertime, this is something you might want to consider, is a heated bird bath, because even if it's just slightly above freezing temperature, it saves the bird the energy it needs to melt the snow inside, and they can use that energy for keeping their bodies warm. So a heated bird bath will be a big magnet for birds and other creatures. And of course, there is some maintenance to it. So you need to, clean it out so we don't spread diseases from bird to bird, from animal to animal. And location is important. You need to put it somewhere where the birds are not going to get attacked by the other creatures. So somewhere where Fluffy can't sneak up on the bird bath. Speaking of Fluffy, they love the bird bath too. And it's not just, our pets, our dogs and cats and all the rest. There are lots of other animals that would be attracted to your bird bath. So you don't necessarily, I always hesitate to name anything, giving it a bird bath or a bird house. There are lots of different creatures that really can't read, and they don't really understand the names that we've given to these things. So lots of creatures will use this water, especially in the time of drought. And then how we shape our water features in our yard makes a big difference. It might fit the style of the house to have a regulated, sort of clean architectural edge to the pond thing. But any animal that's attracted to the sound of the water will go in for a drink. And of course, they might not be able to get out. And this doesn't just apply to birds. Any little toad that's in there, even though toads and frogs and all can swim, they do like to be able to rest. They need to be able to get out as well. So what do we need around any water feature in our yards? The same thing we would appreciate. We need to have somewhere where they can get out. They all need a beach. Beaches are extremely important for all the water features that you have in your yard. They need to be able to get in and they need to be able to get out. So you can still have a more formal feature, but it's best just anywhere to be able to think about the escape route. So water safety is also important for the wildlife. And if you build it, they will come. Any of the creatures that are in your area will come. It won't just be the frogs, but you'll be surprised to see who will come to the yard. So water is an incredibly powerful thing to have in the yard. And if you're going to put in a pond feature, there's certain things that you need to follow. If you have you need to have different levels so that the animals can escape. If you have fish or other things in your pond, frogs, and you want to have the three types of plants: the deep emergent plants, the ones that will be rooted in the bottom and come up through the water. You want the floating plants, and you want the submerged plants. So all these plants are going to do what plants do. They're going to use up the extra nitrogen in the water that might be coming from the fish or other animals in the water. They're also going to shade the pond so that you don't get algae, and they're going to keep the water temperature a little cooler. So these are really important. I dug a pond in my backyard. The first year I put it in, put the rubber liner in, did all these things, and before I could get my plants in, before I could get anything in, the pond turned a beautiful pea green color. It was full of algae, and it happened so quickly. But I put in the plants, I put in a couple of fish, and the other thing that I did was I went down to the local pond and got a gallon of water, and I dumped that in the pond. And that gallon of water from the pond contained all sorts of little micro creatures that really sort of helped establish the food chain in the water. And of course, if you put in a little aerator, that oxygenates it and keeps it going. And the first time when I first did this, it was years ago, I thought, well, I don't know, maybe it'll work. But within a few days, that pond had gone from pea green to crystal clear. I could see every little rubber wrinkle on that liner at the bottom of the pond. So it really does work. So it's very simple. Just add a few ingredients and you've got yourself a pond that will attract wildlife. And one of the creatures that's really fun to attract are the frogs and the toads. They will come. They will hear that water. Again, it's not just the birds that will hear the water. The frogs will hear the water, and they will start to breed in your pond. And it's lovely when you go to the pond and you watch them all jumping in before you. They will also provide those wonderful sounds that you'll get this time of the year with the wood frogs and the spring peepers and then the tree frogs and the other ones, the other frogs that come throughout the season. And by having the frogs there, you will also keep the algae down because they will be, the tadpoles will eat the algae and help keep the pond clean. And then with that beach, they'll be able to escape when the time is that they've developed their legs and move on. But the tadpoles will also attract other creatures who will want to come to eat the tadpoles and frogs. And I think one of the things that you definitely want to attract to your garden are toads. They're some of my favorite little creatures in the garden. Sometimes they're really kind of hard to see because they blend in so well. They're beautifully camouflaged. We have the American toad, and we also have oh gosh, I'm trying to think. But the toads in the garden are great for keeping the insects down. So they're sort of the best insect control that you could have on the lower level of your garden. Now you can get the very fancy toad houses, but really just an upturned clay pot that's been broken is a perfect place. And again, a little bit of water for them will be all that they need. Or you can get more fancy. You can submerge the pots. Any place to give them a little shelter from the sun and a little respite from the predators. So if you have clay pots, dig them in. If you've got stones, stack them up. Make these little hidey holes for them, and they will then provide you with wonderful entertainment as well as great service by keeping the garden pests at control. But once you've invited them into your yard, you have to make sure that you are not going to mow them over. Quite often at the nature center, we get a lot of toads brought into the nature center that have met a weed whacker. Usually the weed whacker wins. So if you happen to be, if you invite these creatures into your yard, walk your yard before you mow the lawn. And if you have some high areas, let them escape before you, so they get a chance to survive, to populate your pond. And here is one of the things that quite often we think of as a real detriment to our yards. We've got all these sticks and logs and things like that. This is a great hidey hole for the frogs and a lot of other creatures too. The insects will go in there into these piles, and then they'll be followed by the toads. So anytime you have some brush, I know this is a great a hiding place for the birds after they visit a bird feeder, to go into these brush piles. But the brush piles really serve a multitude of creatures. So you can stack them neatly. You can have a rough pile. And I don't think we use enough wood in our yard. This will not only attract the toads, but it'll attract the salamanders. And we have to think also about the different life, for the wildlife. We have to think about their different life cycles. Now, some frogs will hibernate down at the bottom, or brumate down at the bottom of a pond. Others will dig into the soil below the frost line. My favorite one is this lovely wood frog who will freeze solid like a little frog popsicle. His eyes will freeze, his brain, his liver, his lungs, everything will freeze. And then it should be in about maybe even next week, they'll start to thaw out, and you'll hear their wonderful quacking sounds, which is, so for me, the sign of spring. So think about, if you have that pond, think about how you're going to keep that pond water free of ice. Because during the wintertime, when the leaves and all the organic debris accumulates at the bottom of the pond, it's going to start to decompose, and it's going to give off methane, which, if trapped under the ice, will actually suffocate the frogs and then the fish. So by keeping a bubbler in there, or a little fountain, and water free, it takes a long time for water to freeze. If it's moving, it's harder for water to freeze. So this will keep just a little area open, and that will be enough to keep all the little creatures that are hibernating underneath alive until next spring. And for the ones that winter over underground, you can build them a hibernaculum. Whether it's, you can take all of your leaves and pile them at the back of your yard, they will find it, they will go underneath. Or again, those wonderful, wonderful logs, pile them up, pile dirt on top, they will go down underneath, and that will be their ideal spot for the winter. Think about how you can incorporate logs into your garden. If you have a tree that fell down, have it chopped up, but don't drag it away. Sorry about that. Don't drag it away. Leave it in your yard and let it decompose. As it decomposes, it becomes food for lots of different little insects that will decompose the wood. Those then become food for a lot of the amphibians that come into the yard, and birds too. So this as the wood decomposes, which will be a little while, it will then add organic matter to the soil as well. So you'll be doing something beneficial for your garden soil as well as for the creatures that live in the soil. And speaking of old dead trees, this is an absolutely wonderful use of dead wood. I mean, lots of different animals will use that, those old dead trees. And that is the where they will make their nests. So if you have a tree that's not going to be, I got my phone on, not going to fall on your house or on your neighbor's car or anything like that, leave that up. That is the high rent real estate in the forest, or for the wildlife. Not only do they have housing, but they also have food. So it's like a supermarket apartment building for the wildlife. And of course, some of them will excavate their own, like the woodpeckers. Others will do a sort of a tidy up job, like the chickadees. But this is really the key. These are the woodpeckers are the keystone species for the other creatures. Far better than getting a birdhouse that you then have to maintain. I like to have the nature do the maintenance. If you do have a birdhouse, you have to size the hole properly, as you know. It's so much better when the birds pick their own proper spots. But if you do a birdhouse, and put a predator guard on, this is give them at least a fair chance, and then make sure you have to clean it out. So it's a little bit more work than letting the woodpeckers excavate new holes every year. As gardeners, we like to have a variety of plants. And it's lovely to have a variety of plants so that the birds can choose their own material for nesting. If you can leave materials out for them, but it's so much better when they choose. They know which ones to do. So by planting a variety of things in your yard, especially if they happen to be native plants, then the birds will know exactly what to do with the materials that you provided for them. And speaking of birds, in the next few weeks, once the ground's not quite so mucky, it's a good time to get out there and do the pruning. So you can do it in late fall, or you can do it in fall or early spring. But make sure you don't do any pruning later in the season, because there's nothing sadder than having just pruned a bush. Come across a bird's nest that you've now exposed, and there's no putting that branch back to hide it. So that bird's nest is just going to be vulnerable to predation. So, and speaking of fall, in the fall, consider all those leaves that fall in your yard, rather than thinking of them as something you have to get rid of. Think of it as something that the trees are feeding themselves. This is an incredibly valuable resource in our yards. So for so long, we've been conditioned to think we've got to get rid of the leaves. And then we turn around and buy mulch. But mulch is not a particularly good thing in the garden. It comes from the part of the tree that has chemicals in it that wards off insects. So these little mulch islands, they look wonderful to us. There's little biological deserts there. There's nothing much going on there. You'd never see any birds there. And then it sometimes forms a crust. You have a few decomposers in there, but nothing much is going on there. Instead, take those leaves and save them. You've all heard the thing, leave the leaves for wildlife. This is where the woolly bear caterpillars are going to hibernate in there. So rake those leaves over the pile. You can mow them over, though you might be chopping up some of the insect life that's adhering to the leaves. But leave those leaves and rake them over into your garden and use them as a living mulch in your not living mulch, but a mulch in your yard. That's what the trees are trying to do that time in the fall. They're trying to feed themselves the leaves that they just produced. It will add to the organic matter of the ground. Pine straw is just absolutely fantastic. If you have white pine trees, don't throw this stuff out. Rake it up, put it in your garden beds as much as you can. This is what they do in all the top-notch show gardens. I think Wave Hill uses pine straw. But if you run them over with a lawnmower, they're not going to mat together. They're going to be a great addition, add organic matter to your soil, And when you do that, all the little creatures, the little shredders, the detritivores are going to be in that soil, and then they will become food for the foraging birds. Little backwards hop dance to pull back the mulch, and then they get the insects. So when you lose the leaves, you can you are actually making a ground feeder for these birds. So this is a pretty sterile landscape. It's not going to attract anything. So we have to think about how can we do it. Looks lovely, looks, but how did we get here? How did we get to this sort of idea that this is something we want? A lot of the plants, as I said earlier, are not from around here. Some animals will use them, but not much. And it usually requires an incredible amount of input. I love this, spring yard work when I feel one with nature. And it's all about chopping and poisoning and pruning, and this is not going to attract anything to your yard. This is going to ward them off, and it's not good for us either. So, think about, I know, as an Audubon, you're aware that, as the birds migrate, they happen to be migrating just at the time we're all getting out into our garden. And a lot of the herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers all come in this beautiful little packaging with these little pellets, time release pellets. And the birds eat them and fly away from your yard and end up somewhere else. I know an awful lot of birds come to the nature center. We do a lot of wildlife rehabilitation at the nature center. And it's always very sad when we see songbirds that have ingested pesticides. It's just not worth it. So, I go around, I talk to garden clubs, and I try to tell them, this is not a good thing. Instead, I think we should, as I said earlier, we need to relax a little bit more in our gardens, mow a few paths, concentrate on those areas for, your efforts, and leave the rest to grow up. You can mow this once a year in the very early spring, just as the ground is getting a little drier, and then let it go. I did this in my yard. I had a 2-acre, suburban yard. And early on in my gardening days, I was mowing around one section of our backyard. And theoretically, that's where my children were supposed to play soccer or football or baseball or something like that. But my boys took up crew. They didn't need the yard at all. So I thought, this is ridiculous mowing this. So I stopped mowing it, and essentially it grew up like this. And I mowed the path, and I put a concrete plinth in the middle of 2 intersecting paths and a giant, decorative rabbit, concrete rabbit on top. And it looked very intentional. And at first it was just grass that grew up, and now I have goldenrod and phlox and black-eyed Susans and Monarda. Some of them I've added myself, some of them just come. And many years ago, I had a garden club tour in my backyard. And, all the other little gardens, which required an awful lot of work, nobody remembered them. They all remembered the area of my yard that I didn't mow, and that, they liked the look of it. So, they're always worried about, oh my gosh, there might be ticks, but think about some areas of your yard you never go to if it's a big yard. And, if you have a mowed path like this, the ticks are going to be in the grass. They're not going to be on the short grass. So, and you can get ticks anywhere. So, but what I found is that in the area where I have a lot of, the taller grass, I have fireflies. My neighbor whose grass is short has no fireflies. They're all in my yard. So where you have that taller vegetation, you have more wildlife, you have more insect life. I see birds in there, I see things happening, and you get the movement of the tall grass. And so this is more what nature is looking for. They're looking for areas. Again, this is the shelter aspect for the insects. And I've also had some ground nesting sparrows in there. And then there's this concept, if you do have a lawn, lay off the herbicides, let the violets and the dandelions and the clover grow, because then you will be essentially having a very low pollinator garden. the early bees and early insects love to come and find these flowers growing. Now, there's not necessarily, well, the violets are native, the clover and the dandelions aren't, but they're very important for the early pollinators nonetheless. They've been here for quite some time. And I like the concept that people are now saying is no mow May. Consider not mowing your lawn at all while these flowers are in bloom. So, and it all depends on how much rain you get that year. But at least if you can go the first 3 weeks of May without mowing, you will give a lot of insect life a chance to complete its life cycle, get the pollen, get the nectar they need to start their colonies. And I think it looks much better than just plain grass. And if you have violets in the yard, of course, once you get them, you're always going to have them because they're very good at reproducing. But if you have violets in your yard, you will have this wonderful butterfly. This is called the Great Spangle Fritillary. And the reason you will have this butterfly is because violet leaves are the only food that the Great Spangle Fritillary caterpillars will eat. So, and this is one of our most common butterflies because we have so many violets. So I love to encourage my violets to grow so that I get these butterflies. And we tend to think of pollinators. We think of bumblebees. I mean, of honeybees rather. Honeybees were brought over by the colonists to pollinate their plants. But protecting the bumblebees, really, the honeybees is really not necessary. They're not. They do have some insect problems, some varroa mites and some diseases. But generally, we always have enough honeybees. What we really need to concentrate on is our native bees. We have over 300 native bees, and they come in all sizes. I love their names. The cuckoo bees and the sweat bees and the digger bees and the miner bees and the plasterer bees. These are just fantastic creatures to have in the yard. And they're actually much better pollinators than the honeybees. The honeybees are a generalist pollinator, and these guys are more specialized. The bumblebees in particular are extremely good at pollinating some of our native plants. So these are the ones that we need to think about how we can modify our yards to encourage. If we're interested in bringing the pollinators into our yards. These are the guys that are in trouble, sometimes because of the insects that are brought by the honeybees, and sometimes because of how we manage our yards. So a lot of times people are very concerned. I'm going to get, about being stung. I know, around schools, they can't have flowers because kids are going to get stung. But actually, our native bees are not the kind of bees that nest like this. The honeybees are colony nesters because they're making honey so they can survive the winter. Most of our bees are solitary nesters. And because of that, because they're not protecting this incredible hive, they rarely sting. So, and some of them don't sting at all. So encouraging the native pollinators in our yard is much better than encouraging the honeybees. And the honey, everyone wants to protect the honeybees, but I love the phrase someone said, protecting the honeybees to save our native bees is like protecting chickens to save songbirds. And I thought that was a well put way. So we don't have to worry about the honeybees. But a lot of our native bees are ground nesters. So it's good to have a portion of your yard where there are bare patches so that the queen bees can hibernate for the winter, and then they will raise their young in solitary nests underground. So mulching and tilling. So in certain areas you don't want to have mulch. You don't want to be digging around because that will disturb these ground nesting bees. You can put up bee blocks or these tubes. I know you can go to the store and you can buy all sorts of fancy, bee hotels. The big thing is to, locate them properly so they're, facing the morning sun so the bees can get a little extra warmth when they wake up and shelter it from wind and rain, your little nest. But and put a fresh bundle of stems every year. So things like elderberry stems are really good because they're hollow. And these are some of the bees would appreciate these kinds of things. There is a little bit of a doubt as to whether these are really the best way of doing it, because anytime you bring animals together artificially like this, you might be, especially if you have a lot of them, you might be concentrating them and allowing them to spread disease to each other, sort of like a little mini pandemic in there. So again, back to those log piles. Bees will do this. Bees will go into this. They will find the best place for themselves. Really can't say enough about the benefits of log piles. And if you're going to try to, garden for the pollinators, then you need to think about a season of flowers. So think about from early spring, there are those violets again, and have, a series of flowers that will take you all the way through the growing season into October. And this requires a bit of planning to get it. And perhaps you might not get all of the months. There's certain times of the month that there are more flowers than certain months that are, there are more flowers than others. But think about that when you're going to the nursery. Think, do I have the ones for the early? I know I have a few gaps in my garden. I have a great lot of blooms in the spring, and then there seems to be a quiet period until later in the year. And it's always very tempting to do what I call the polka dot planting, a little of this, a little of that, a little of this. A lot of bees learn which flowers to pollinate. There's some discussion about whether this is, okay or not, but some of the thought is that it's better to put a bigger planting so that the insects can find them. They actually learn how to pollinate certain plants that are in bloom at a certain time. So if you put out the large plantings, it'll be easier for them to find them, and they'll be more skilled at pollinating them. And again, if you've got a wild area, think about putting some of those plants in there. They're a lot less work than having a perennial garden, and it's just fun to walk through the paths and listening to everything. If you get a chance, go down to Storm King near Poughkeepsie, New York. I don't know if any of you, it's a big sculpture garden. They have wonderful native plant swaths of grasses and things. And the insect life is just so dynamic in these areas. So, with more variety, more height than a lawn could ever provide. Those lawns are just not much going on. And when you think about the plants you put into your garden, that makes a big difference. If you were a bee, this plant is telling you where to land. It's showing you, I've got things for you. I've got nectar, I've got pollen. This one's just a hot mess. This one sometimes we like because, the double flowers are so attractive. It's much showier than this bloodroot. But in this case, this plant has been cultivated so that it produces lots of petals, but it's probably used up its energy balance, and there probably is not enough left over to make any pollen or nectar. So it's attractive to us, but not necessarily to the bee. And again, sometimes the cultivars are showier for us. They've been bred to make them attractive to us, but sometimes they don't have the same quality of nectar. This is not true for all plants, but if you have a choice in your garden, the better thing is to try to choose the closest one to the native as possible. That would be the one that the animals, the bees and the bird, in this case the hummingbird, has co-evolved with. So it's part of their their long-term life cycle. And yes, you can put in things that will attract butterflies, like this, the butterfly bush. But this is not thinking through the whole life cycle. This is only going to attract the adults. Yes, the butterflies are going to come and use the nectar, but there will be no holes in the leaves of that butterfly plant bush. And we need to see holes in our leaves. We need to see that someone has been eating. That's the whole part of that food chain. Insects eat plants, and then the other creatures eat the insects. So we need to see. We need to have the host plants for the caterpillars that will then turn into the butterflies. So we need to think of that whole life cycle. We can't just think of the time when they're the butterflies. We have to think of them. What are they going to eat when they're a caterpillar? So some of the caterpillars are very non-picky. This gray hair streak will eat lots of different families of plants, lots of different kinds of plants. But others, we know the monarch only will eat milkweed. So if you don't have milkweed, you won't get the monarch butterflies. It's not that you won't get them in your flower garden. They'll nectar from a variety of flowers, but you won't have the caterpillars that will then turn into the butterflies. So this is sort of the poster child of charismatic insects. Everyone loves the monarch butterfly, so there's been a lot of emphasis in planting milkweed in your garden, and it's starting to make a bit of a difference, I think. But we need, I think, to do a whole lot more. And you're not just going to get the monarch; you're going to get these wonderful red milkweed beetles. There are all sorts of other little creatures that you get when you plant these specialized plants. And then when you think about it, think about the reason why we want the pollinators. The reason we want the pollinators is not only so we can see the butterflies, but it's so that the plant will get pollinated and then create food. So this dogwood will have leaves that the caterpillars from the spring azure will eat. It'll be visited by, the flowers will be visited by other butterflies, and then of course and bees. And once the flower is pollinated, of course it's going to make food for birds. So if you think about that whole life cycle, the reason why we want the pollinators is so that the seeds and berries will be produced. And you want to grow your own bird food, and you want to plant your plants wisely. And I love the fact that every year we buy so much bird seed. The black oil sunflower. Now I know I buy black oil sunflower seed, but I think in Nebraska and Kansas and North and South Dakota, they're growing these things. They had a real problem with blackbirds coming, all variety of blackbirds coming and eating the sunflower seeds. And the farmers were asked the United States Department of Agriculture if they could kill off those birds because they're eating bird seed. And fortunately, the USDA said, no, you can't do that. It would be a bad look. You're growing bird seed. That's just what's going to happen. So, leave the seeds on your perennials, throughout the season. Don't mow them down at the end of the year. Leave the stems up. Some of the bees will hibernate in the stems if they're nice hollow stems. Chop them if leave the seed heads into the fall. If you want to chop them later on, then you can, some of the stems can be hollow for some of the hibernating bees and insects. But these are mini bird feeders right here. Now, when I first started gardening, these were the plants I was told to plant because they had lots of berries. And of course, and I read all the books. This was in the 1980s. But again, we weren't thinking through that whole life cycle. When the birds eat them, they pass through their digestive tract, end up as an invasive mess out in the woods. So we have to think through what exactly are the birds eating and what do we want to have spread in the wild. Burning bush is a very attractive plant, but it spreads forever through our woods. I know at the Nature Center, I was in charge of finding jobs for community service people to do. These were not volunteer community service, these were court-ordered community service people. And one of the jobs I'd give them is to pull out invasive species. And I knew those people at least knew never to plant burning bush because they'd spend hours pulling these things out. But what can we plant? Well, we need to plant natives. We need to plant natives. That is the best thing that we can do in our garden, bar none. All those other things, put in water, leave bare spots, let the grass grow. And the most important thing, if you want wildlife in your garden, is to plant natives. Why is this not moving? Next. There we are. Why natives? You've probably all heard native plants provide just the right size nutrition and just the right nutrition. It's always interesting that the seeds, the berries, are always just the right size to fit down the mouth of the bird. They are, as opposed to we have the Coosa dogwood, and we have the native dogwood. The native dogwood makes a lovely little berry that is readily eaten by the birds, and you never see a mess underneath a native dogwood, as opposed to the Coosa dogwood, which blooms a little later and then makes this big sort of, large, messy, soft berry. And that tree is designed for the creatures where it came from in Asia. It's designed for monkeys to eat. We can eat the Coosa dogwood berries. We can't eat the native dogwood berries. So it all depends how these animals have co-evolved. The plants are designed to have the birds distribute their seeds in their droppings. And, so you have to plant the right thing to have the distribution of those seeds. And they bloom and they produce berry at just the right time of the year for the bird. So the yellow rump warblers will come through in the fall and eat the bayberries. The mother and father birds will feast on June berries while they're working hard to raise their young. Everything is timed beautifully. This is lovely choreographed dance between the plants and the wildlife. And landscaping with native plants has the biggest impact on the health of our environment. Hopefully, you've all read these books. These are books by Douglas Talimay. He's an entomologist with the University of Delaware. It's certainly revolutionized how I think about my gardening. And he wrote the book Bring Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope. He has a couple of other books. But as an entomologist, he looked at native plants and he compared them with the plants that we usually put in our garden, the non-natives. And what he found was really staggering. He found that the native plants support our native insects. Now, they support them really, really well, as much as 35 times more caterpillars on the native plants as on the, especially on the native woody plants, as opposed to the non-native woody plants. So, and that's because our insects are also co-evolved with the plants. So, you think, oh my gosh, I don't want that many caterpillars on my plants. But you're not going to see them because they are. That's what those lovely little beady eyes are for. They're going to find those caterpillars and they're going to feed them to their chicks, because that's what caterpillars are for. They are for feeding their baby birds. And these, the research is, the mom will come and feed that caterpillars to the one with the largest mouth. It'll go to sleep. Dad will come back with the next one. And they'll work their way down. And hopefully he won't wake up before that one gets fed, the one with the littlest mouth, because if there's not enough food around, they might only raise these guys. And the birds are actually very good at identifying plants in your yard. They can check out to see, which ones would be suitable. So if you have birds nesting in your yard, that's a good sign that you've got things there to feed them. And why caterpillars? Well, this is what the actually stunning thing. It takes between 5,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to raise one nest of chickadees. I mean, that's an incredible amount and that's only to get them out of the nest, and then they still need more once they're on the ground as fledglings. So you need a lot of caterpillars. And fortunately, our native plants support the caterpillars. Their non-native plants do not. So wherever you have native vegetation, you're going to have more bird species and more birds in total numbers, and vice versa. You have nothing much living in your yard if it's all non-native. And this is what Douglas Talimay was able to find, is that there are certain plants that support more of our native insects. So these are all native plant species, and you can see oaks are absolutely astounding with the number of caterpillars that they support. And these are still healthy amounts. But look at the numbers on the non-native. Look at this. Butterfly bush, yes, they'll feed the nectar, but nothing eats their leaves. Forsythia, maybe one. These things, these were, insect poor plants. So we need those insects to feed the other wildlife. And 90% of the insects are specialists and can only eat one or few of the species of the native. So having a wide variety of native plants in your yard, you can support a lot of different things. And the best one, as I just showed you, is to put in the oak trees. If you can do one thing, just plant an oak tree, especially a white oak tree. You might have to protect it in this early stage from deer browse, but oaks are phenomenal at producing caterpillars. But then you have to think about what's going on underneath. Here's this wonderful oak tree, but there's grass right under it, just like these trees. And so if you have all those wonderful insects being produced here, some of them are going to, when they pupate, they're going to drop to the ground and not going to be able to get through this turf grass. So what you want to do under your trees, plant native plants. this will allow when the insects are pupating, they'll be able to drop to the ground and get into the ground so they can hibernate for the winter and come back at their proper time the next year. It will also save the tree from being dinged by the lawnmower. It will also save you it'll cut down on the amount of grass that you have in your yard, and it gives you an opportunity to plant other things. This is the native wild ginger, and here we have some wonderful ferns, but there are a variety of native plants that like to grow, especially under the leaf litter of a tree. So by having a tree surrounded completely by grass, you're going to disrupt the life cycle of the insects that are going to then feed the birds. So, and if you want to see, all this in action, there's so many beautiful, wonderful native plants. You can go to the garden in the woods in Framingham, Massachusetts. It's a lovely trip if you haven't been there. You get to see these plants and really see how they might look in your garden. This used to be called the New England Wildflower Society. They're now called the Native Plant Trust in Framingham, Massachusetts. You can also go up the road into the sort of northern section up in Greenfield in Massachusetts. You can go to Nasami if you were interested in buying some of the plants. But it's this is beautiful, especially in the spring, but it's beautiful all times of the year. You get to see the beauty of our native plants. And if that's too far, you can always come and visit us at the Nature Center in Canton, Connecticut. We have a wildflower garden. Now, we have some of the shrubs that we planted have grown up, and so we have fewer flowers, but we have a lot of shrubs that attract the birds. And it started off as a native plant butterfly garden. But what I find is at the end of the season, because of all the seeds, because of all the pollination that's gone on, it really becomes a bird garden. The birds really come into their own. I mean, in the early part of the year, they come into the butterfly garden to eat the caterpillars, and then later in the year, they come to eat the seeds and things. So when you think about gardening in your yard, think about the different life cycles of the animals. Where are they going to spend the winter? How are they going to get water? Where are they going to raise their young? And if you start thinking about the various life cycles of the different creatures, then you can make your yard more hospitable to the various creatures who would come and use those areas. And again, flowers are good, logs are great, and seeds and berries are fantastic. So you don't have to necessarily think about flowers. Some of the trees and bushes are also great for pollinators and also provide wonderful food for later in the year. So lots of things that you can do in your garden. I'm just going to escape myself here, stop sharing. And I was wondering if anyone had any questions. All right.
And I'll start at the top of the list and work my way down. And as I'm doing this, I'll ask if you want to unmute yourself, those of you that ask questions. Tom, do you want to ask your question about water?
Not you.
Sure. Yeah, so I just was questioning when you're going over like the water, if we have like a native water source, like a stream or brook nearby,
Yes.
if we put a water source in our garden, are they going to come to that, or are they just going to go to the stream or brook?
Well, there will be different ones that go to the stream and brook. If you have a stream or brook, I think it's even better because they, you have the opportunity to enhance the plants along the side of the stream or brook with some native wild plants. But there are certain ones that don't like moving water, that will prefer a pond. If you have an area in the stream where it's quieter, they'll find their own place. They'll actually, if you can give them a choice. Then the biggest problem is if you've attracted them to the yard, you don't want them to get killed off in the wintertime. So you need to have that bubbler going. But if you have a stream, they're going to find their way to that. They might come up and visit your pond and then leave and go back to the stream. It depends. There are certain animals that like being in streams. There are certain animals like being in ponds. So if you do put in a pond or even just a bird bath, I mean, they will find it. They will enjoy it. But if you've got water already, that saves you a lot of extra work.
Great, thanks so much.
All right.
Leslie Johnson, you had a couple of questions.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I was just curious if it's okay to use like straw or old hay for mulch, particularly in larger areas.
Yeah, as long as it's straw. If you use hay, it's going to have seeds in it, some weed seeds. So if you use straw, but straw is harder to find these days. Straw is good, but again, I remember going seeing the years ago. I listened to Roger Swain. He was the guy who used to be the head of the Victory Garden, which was a show on PBS. And he's the guy with the red suspenders, if anyone remembers. And I remember him saying that you can tell a really good gardener by how little they buy. Think about the resources you have in your yard. If you have leaves, if you have pine straw, I've even gone, at the time when people, bag their leaves, I've even gone in the evening hours and picked up some of those bagged leaves from other people's yards and brought them home to my yard. Especially if they've got white pine trees. And I'll feel them and say, yeah, this is a good one. And think about, resources that you can get, or resources that you have to go buy. Don't buy peat moss or, and bark mulch is so expensive. And it also sometimes comes with jumping worms. So think about what you have on hand. And if you happen to have straw, good. But if you have hay, it's going to have weeds in it.
Okay, thank you.
Amy. Or did we get that question about the signs answered?
Let's see. I can.
She had a question about no mow May signs. Does anybody make them?
I don't know where you can get no mow May, but you can always have your own made up. But I'm sure probably on the internet you can get the no mow May. Whether anyone would read it, and talk to your neighbors, saying I'm keeping those for the. We have such peer pressure in our gardens that it has to be maintained a certain way, and some areas are more so than others. I know there's a house down the street from me, and their lawn was looking rather unkempt for a while. And then the next thing I knew, they brought in 2 cows to graze, which was rather stunning. That's how it's supposed to be, but yeah, but if you have an unkempt area, I always find if you mow around the edge and put a statue thing in it, somehow it looks intentional. As long as it looks intentional, people seem to accept that. It looks like, oh yes, they're doing that on purpose rather than they've just forgotten to mow their lawn. So in my yard, I think I see one of the questions was with the native grasses. No, my yard was just lawn grasses, and I let them grow up. And now, mostly, I have an awful lot of goldenrod. Goldenrod is a bit of a thug in the garden, but it's one of the best plants for insects. So, and it also is a great pollinator plant later in the year. So, in a certain section of the area, I let go. I've dug out the grass and I've planted some new things in, and it's getting it gets shaded out by the taller plants later in the year. So it's not doing, my grass is not doing particularly well in that area. But yeah, grass can be a bit of a thug in the meadow. The turf grass. You can add other types of native grasses in there.
In one of the parks in New Haven, where we have an urban oasis, there's a section that did not get mowed. It was just ordinary turf grass that did not get mowed for a year. And some students did a survey of the insects in it. And they compared it to an area that was mowed. And just not mowing the grass increased both the diversity and the number total number of insects. So
It's truly amazing, and you get also the benefit not only of the insects, but you get the benefit of seeing movement in your garden. And I think that's when the wind blows, grass moves. It's so much more alive. And again, I did not originally add anything to my yard. I just let it grow, and year after year after year, I got more and more things in there. Some I've added, but very little I've added. Mostly it came on its own. So, I was very pleased with that. And the hours and hours I've saved not having to mow that section has been invaluable too. That's
Beverly,
another question.
would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yeah, we have an area in our yard that is it slopes down,
Mhm.
and it turns out it's like, we have a lot of beautiful trees that came when we moved here, but it's very shady, and over the years, the grass not growing there. I was wondering if there is something, either plants or flowers that would be tolerant of the shade and kind of the muddy area.
Yeah. Oh, you're in luck. There are a lot of plants that like moist shade. A lot of native plants. As a matter of fact, if you go to any native plant book, I used to have them here, you will find ones that really like the moist shade. So any of the ground covers, there are a lot of bushes that do. Grass and trees are sort of natural enemies. They don't, the grass shades out they don't like to be together. So under that shade, you have a wonderful opportunity. And if you've still got grass there, one of the best way to smother that grass, the easiest way, is to get cardboard and lay down sheets of cardboard and then dump on the leaves on top.
Okay.
And let it go. Do that for a year or two. The little insects in there will, help. The cardboard will decompose, and then you can plant right in. You can actually plant sometimes right into into that after a year or so.
Oh.
So.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It was very helpful.
All right.
Bobby Fisher.
Well, mine's kind of a silly question, but do you have a favorite garden shrub that you like, or a bush that's, kind of four-season interest and good habitat, etc.?
I love shadbloom. It's also
Me too.
like serviceberry or juneberry. I mean, I love all the different names for it. It could be either a shrub or it can be a tree. It's just a wonderful thing. It bloomed, one of the first ones to bloom. It has very small leaves, so there's hardly any raking involved in them, but they produce wonderful berries that attract the cedar waxwings. They find it. I remember one time I was planting some, and they were still in the pots, and the cedar waxwings were finding the berries. It's just a lovely, lovely native tree. But there's some absolutely gorgeous shrubs and trees. I also like it's more of a little bit more south, the red bud. The bees love that. It's got lovely pea-like flowers, and that's a great plant. The northern honeysuckle and the cleft, sweet pepper bush. Those are. There's so many just trouble-free, but also the dogwood. The variety of dogwoods and the gray and the silky dogwood. They produce lovely flowers in the spring, and then they get pollinated very quickly. The pollinators love them, and then they produce these beautiful fruits that the birds just gobble up. So I like my plants to work hard. I want them to, I like them to look pretty, but I want them to feed something. I want them to be part of that food chain out there.
I'm going to throw in a
Thank
plug.
you. That gives me a good list there. Thank
Right.
you.
I'm going to throw in a plug for our native plant nursery, Urbanscapes, at which we're growing most of those plants you just mentioned, those shrubs.
Lovely. And the native plants, nurseries really need our support because it's one of those chicken and an egg things. If we don't support them, then they can't stay in business to provide those native plants that we need in our garden. And we need to rethink how we're doing our gardens, why we're doing our gardens. I just listened to a wonderful talk by Benjamin Boat about garden ethics and sort of the, beyond pretty, I think is one of the things. We need to think beyond pretty. We need to think of useful plants, and the native plant nurseries really need our support. And we need to get those plants in our gardens.
We've got a couple more questions here.
Sure.
John, you want to ask your question? Unmute yourself.
I was trying to get back over there. Hi, this is Shannon with John.
Oh,
So we have hi there. We have a good sized yard and we have a very large section of natural meadow. We had turf grass and we just let it grow up. It's been what, 4 years now or so.
Yeah.
And we started out with a variety. It's teeming with wildlife, especially by, with bugs, insects by August. So it's just alive and buzzing. It's amazing. Actually, we've done video but sometimes just to watch it because it's so cool.
Yeah.
But we're having, I won't call it monoculture, but we have a lot of bone set and goldenrod, as you had mentioned too.
Yeah.
And it's like, so we really don't even, doesn't look like much of anything but overgrown weedy grass until August, and we have a few things in there, but I just wanted to see if you recommend when you're getting that much of it, like over half, 3/4 of it is just those two things. Is it a good idea? I was thinking of putting some trenches through it or something and pass through it and seeding with getting some natural seed from a local nursery. And so we get more variety throughout the summer. We do live in a neighborhood, a very trimmed neighborhood, if you will. People have their yards come except for us. So is it a good idea to mix that up a little bit?
You can. I mean, you can also consider using plugs, going into a little section and putting in some plugs. That might be good. I'm always of two minds because goldenrod supports so many insects, which some of the others don't. But you could consider putting in some thin leaf mountain mint or mountain mints, some monardas. The Rebecca Frita is a very short-lived thing, but it sells seeds. If you have some open spaces, you can go in and just you can go in and edit. I mean, it depends how big an area it is.
It's big. So overall, though, you don't necessarily recommend doing it. There's no harm in leaving what's there and just.
No, I mean, one of the reasons there's so much goldenrod because it tends to fight off some of the other plants anyways. But you could consider some of its companion plants or things like asters. Again, that's in the later season. And another one that looks beautiful with the goldenrod is the New York ironweed. That stunning color combination of the dark purple of the ironweed and the yellow of the goldenrod. But you can edit. You can dig up certain sections and put anything else you want in there. But I think goldenrod's fine too.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right. Meadows are hard in Connecticut because we're not really meadow territory. I mean, you turn your back, you don't mow that meadow, it's going to turn into a forest. Within 5 years, it's going to start doing that.
Yep. We trim it down we cut it down every March to get all the wooded plants out of there, the invasive that don't belong.
And I know at the land trust, we were having a discussion to how you really don't, it's not every year, although it looks neater, especially in a suburban area, but some of our wild areas, we're going to be going to a mowing every other year, or maybe every 3 years, maybe every 4 years. That will be enough to keep the woody vegetation down. But when we mow, we tend to disrupt the insects, especially if you do a fall mowing. The insects that have gone there to hibernate are decimated. So we're thinking of mowing, half a field and mowing the other half the next year. We've designated different fields to be mowed at different times, so we're not wiping out the entire population with annual mowing.
So you're still wiping out the entire population if you mow in March? Because we mow in spring.
Well, some of the insects haven't still woken up yet. So yeah, later, as soon as it starts getting warm and you see some bees flying around, that probably be the time. But then you get into you don't want to mow too late because then you get the birds nesting. So this is, and you don't want to mow too when the ground is wet, because then you'll disrupt that. So it's one of those tricky things. That's why we're sort of going for the every other year. But in the suburban, meadow, where everyone's going to see, I think, you can mow in, late March, early April. You can do that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and then looks like there's one last question about
Right.
bee tubes.
Yes.
When is the proper time to replace them? Too
Every
early-
year. Yeah.
Too early,
but-
too early, you might get the larval bees before they've finished, and
Yeah. Most of those bees
Late
will
is too
not
late.
win. Yeah. Only the queen will winter over. So, in the wintertime, they'll have died back. You won't get any larval bees in those tubes. The bees will go and hibernate in other places. Some of them will hibernate underground. Some of them will hibernate in the stems of some of the plants that you might have. As I said, elderberry, but also some of the hollow stems of some of the annuals that go. So I've read that, cutting some of those garden plants down 18 inches is good. And then, you'll still it'll look neater, but you'll still have the stems for the wintering, some of the wintering pollinators. Yeah, it's tough to know exactly when to do, everything. But I think if you mowed part of it, and you can always leave a section of it unmowed, and then the insects from there will come and replenish that next year.
okay, and then while I was speaking, one last question came in. Kim, you
Yeah.
want to unmute yourself and ask that?
Oh, sure. Hi. Thank you so much for this talk, by the way. I've learned so much.
Oh, good.
I went down the rabbit hole of of planting native plants by zip code on the National Wildlife Federation
yes.
site. And in the course of that research, I found out that some of the plants that seem to be used by birds here and that are very popular aren't actually native to our area, like the red bee balm and several of the rudbeckias and some of the echinaceas. And since they are rather aggressive growers in my small yard, I actually haven't been planting them. And I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on plants like that are neighbors that seem to have some value, but if there are any drawbacks to using them. Thank you.
Yes, some, there's this idea we need to be, the genotypes and the plants are from this area. And, there's really good arguments for that. But we're facing, the alternatives of buying plants that come from, other continents. So I think Douglas Talimay suggests that, 70% of your yard is native plants.
Yeah.
And if there's something that you really love, plant that. A lot of the plants although the Didyma is from the Monarda Didyma is sort of southern Connecticut, and the Monarda fistulosa is more from northern. And we're sort of that transition zone. But things like echinacea is more of a prairie flower from adjacent states. And like one of the native nurseries said, neighboring plants. I don't think there's a problem bringing those into our yard. They're so much better than the non-natives from far away that can run amok. So, I think we're all in the process of figuring this out because we haven't been using our native plants. Although when I go visit my sister in England, I go to the nurseries there and I find that they've got more of our native plants on for sale in their nursery than we have here because it's novel and new. So, but I think if we just, it's good to plant the ones that are from around here. Some of them are going to be aggressive anyway. I mean, certain plants, even though they're native, are aggressive with other plants. Goldenrod is certainly an aggressive garden plant. You have to be really careful with it in the garden. But, I think the direction of going the natives, even if it's native-ish
Yeah.
to our area, it's still a better way to go than bringing in something from the West Coast or, the deep South.
Right. Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
All right.
Last chance.
Wonderful. It was lovely. Is there another?
No, I guess that's it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It was lovely being here tonight, and thank you for the lovely questions and your attention, and have fun in your garden. It's almost garden season again.
And
Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And next week, remember Natural Climate Solutions with Dr. Brooke Bateman. Register at the website. Take care, everybody.